what I think would be difficult for Russia is if they had to confront directly NATO forces in the Black Sea. We've seen quite a lot of Russian aircraft coming close to NATO aircraft that are operating in the Black Sea. We've seen them try to bring down some of the NATO surveillance drones. So they're going very close to the edge at the moment. But I do wonder if they would dare, except in ambiguous and deniable circumstances, whether they would actually take on NATO forces either in the air or at sea.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are talking to Rear Admiral Dr Chris Parry. During his 36 years in the Royal Navy, he's commanded HMS Gloucester, HMS Fearless, and been on operational and combat tours in Northern Ireland, the Gulf and the Falklands. He's now a strategic advisor and commentator. Chris Parry, welcome to Frontline. Thank you so much for your time.
It's my pleasure.
Now, part of the reporting at the moment on Ukraine has been very much turning to food security since Russia pulled out of the grain deal, which allowed safe passage of Ukraine's grain and food supplies through the Black Sea onto the global markets. Just take us through the immediate consequences of Russia pulling out of that deal.
Well, I think if one looks at the balance of cereals, grain, and maize around the world, there's sufficient capacity at the moment to take up the strain of that happening. But the fact of life is that Ukraine produces something like 10% of the wheat of the world and 10 to 12% of the maize. So over the long term, the fact that the cereal, grain, and maize markets are dominated by the United States, Canada, Brazil, Russia, and the EU is going to concentrate markets a lot more. And later in the year, probably, we're going to see some shocks to the system as that resilience is reduced as a result of Ukraine's inability to be able to export its grain and other supplies.
That Ukraine has made a statement similar to that made by Russia, that it will view ships approaching Russian or Ukrainian-held ports to be carrying military equipment. Can there be a safe passage of food exports from Ukraine at the moment?
Yes, it's an interesting point. I mean, it's a natural retaliatory measure by Ukraine to say, look, anything that's heading for Russia or occupied Ukrainian ports is fair game. I think that would happen in any conflict. The only way I think we're going to see grain and other commodities being escorted, if you like, out of Ukraine is if we establish a safe route within the territorial seas of those countries on the western side of the Black Sea down towards the Bosphorus and out into the Mediterranean. So what in effect you would do is say, look, the territorial seas of Moldova, Romania, Bulgaria and Turkey are sovereign jurisdictions, and any ships that are sailing within those waters should actually be free from attack from both Russian and Ukrainian forces. It's only in the last stage when they approach, obviously, Ukrainian territorial seas and the ports of Odessa, Mykolaiv, that they'll be vulnerable and outside those territorial seas. And of course, Russia would have to take the choice of attacking something inside the territorial seas of Bulgaria, Romania or Turkey. And of course, they're NATO countries, and that would represent a significant crossing of a red line, I would think.
So the option that you outlined there means it is plausible to continue the exports.
I would think so. The obvious Russian counter to that is they would concentrate their firepower on Ukrainian territorial seas, and they would probably put mines and other deniable weapons in the water, perhaps unmanned vehicles and things like that to obviously disrupt the traffic. There's obviously implications for insurance, but there's also another option that occurred in the 1980s. And in the 1980s in the Gulf, when Iran chose to intercept ships that were coming out of the Gulf through the Straits of Hormuz, the Americans said, right, what we'll do is we'll flag Kuwaiti tankers as United States ships. And in fact, the Iranians obviously didn't choose to attack the American flag ships because they were being protected by American and other warships. Now that's another option, is you could actually reflag ships and dare Russia to attack them or indeed detain them.
But Russia, in its statement, has threatened the flagships of any countries heading for Ukrainian waters as potentially carrying weapons and therefore as parties to the war on Ukraine's side. Do you think Russia is prepared to start attacking ships at sea?
I think Russia, under the current regime, is capable of almost anything. They're quite desperate. You've got a regime transition taking place in the Kremlin at the moment. Everybody thinks Putin's in charge, but I believe, for one, that he's the front man. And there's a real transition going on in power groups. I always say to people at the moment, if you've seen the film The Death of Stalin, you'll see exactly what's going on in terms of the way people are positioning. So almost anything is possible right now. What I think would be difficult for Russia is if they had to confront directly NATO forces in the Black Sea. We've seen quite a lot of Russian aircraft coming close to NATO aircraft that are operating in the Black Sea. We've seen them try to bring down some of the NATO surveillance drones. So they're going very close to the edge at the moment. But I do wonder if they would dare, except in ambiguous and deniable circumstances, whether they would actually take on NATO forces either in the air or at sea.
As a NATO member, Turkey has been very influential in the past in getting the grain deal agreed and implemented. Can it do anything at the moment?
Well, Turkey's the major player in the southern half of the Black Sea. It's got a fairly interesting relationship with Russia. It's a sort of love-hate relationship. I heard recently that over 1,900 Russian businesses were started up in Turkey in the last year alone to get around some of the sanctions and the other constraints on Russian businessmen. So you've got a quite tight relationship between particularly President Erdogan and President Putin. So that sort of thing can be played to advantage. However, the recent NATO summit in Vilnius, the Turks came up very strongly and said, look, we would want to safeguard these grain and other supplies coming out of Ukraine, and hinted that they would actually protect them as well. They've gone off the boil a bit on that in recent weeks, but it was an interesting statement to make. And of course, after his election win, President Erdogan said he wasn't going to put anything in the way of Sweden joining the NATO alliance. So that was a real turnaround. It's almost as if he's come back in under the aegis of NATO again.
And Russia has been attacking grain storage facilities in Ukraine. Ukraine has attacked a military storage facility and military training ground in Crimea. Do you get a sense at the moment that the war is entering a new phase?
I think it's part of what's been going on for most of this year. Ukraine is probing away at Russian defenses along the borderline of those 4 captured provinces on the mainland. And with regard to Crimea, what Ukraine is doing is trying to distract the Russians away from those front lines and also divert resources. But at the same time is saying, look, when it comes to peace proposals, what we want everybody to remember is that Crimea is part of Ukraine, because we know the Russians will die in a ditch over Crimea, even if they give up the 4 provinces on the mainland. And it will be very difficult indeed for Ukraine to assert any sort of reclaim over Crimea if they don't continually keep it in the public eye, both to their own population and the wider world. In retaliation, of course, Russia has been hitting Odessa and Mykolaiv. What we have to bear in mind also is that the whole war aim of Russia in this particular campaign has been to capture the whole of the bottom third of Ukraine. It's never been their intention to take over the whole of Ukraine. What they want is the bottom third of Ukraine, what effectively was new Russia under Catherine the Great, and Mykolaiv and Odessa are part of the territory they would eventually want to capture. So by, just to use Tacitus's phrase, the old Roman historian, he said they created desolation and call it peace. And that's what the Russians are trying to do to that part of Ukraine at the moment.
And in one of those recent Russian strikes on Odessa, it appears to have hit China's consulate. At the time, Ukraine's economy minister was in China, and it's reported he was told there that China's prepared to expand imports of Ukrainian goods. What's going on here? Does this signify a change in China's position, or is that likely?
No, I think in many ways it's China trying to stay clear of anything that Russia does. At the moment, we're seeing a very strong geopolitical understanding between what I call the Eurasian autocrats of China, Russia, and Iran, and occasionally North Korea, of course. And China tries to disassociate itself with some of the more outrageous or outlandish acts by Russia. But we shouldn't be under any illusions. China is a very close ally of Russia. It sees it as, frankly, a gas station. And one of the slides that I use in one of my presentations has a very large panda sitting on a chair with a small Russian bear waving a Russian flag on its lap. And I'm afraid to say that's how China sees the relationship. It's into damage limitation. It's trying to make friends around the world. At the moment, its economy, as you know, it is not very strong. And politically, there are tensions within the ruling party. So I think they try and do a little often to try and sort of burnish their image and disassociate themselves from what Russia is doing.
The head of the British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, Sir Richard Moore, has accused China, though, of being absolutely complicit in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that the balance of power between Russia and China has shifted in China's favour. He's appealed for Russian defectors to help bring the war to an end. How much do you think his words, what kind of impact do you think they have?
Well, if I'm honest, I'm amazed it's taken him so long to realize that China is the bigger partner. I think that's been the case now for about a decade. Um, One of my colleagues said to me recently, if you think that Russia is a storm, well, China is climate change in terms of the impact on the geopolitical world. So I don't think anybody is under any illusions about the risks associated with China in both the commercial and the strategic space. As for recruiting Russians who aren't very happy with the regime, we've been doing that for something like 100 years since the revolution. So nothing's changed. I would think our intelligence services are very actively recruiting those people who want regime change in Russia and a total cultural and geopolitical shift of Russia to the West. But we have to acknowledge that is the history of Russia. It alternates between facing east and facing west, and that's why you've got a double-headed eagle that actually represents what it is on its flag and its badge.
People like yourself will be scrutinising this war to see how it will inform us about the changing nature of war, and in particular the weaponry. We've seen the increased use of drones, for example, and the Kerch Bridge, which was struck recently. Ukraine has claimed responsibility for it. It was struck by sea drones. What do you see as the biggest noticeable changes from your experience of warfare in what is being used in this one and the way it's being fought?
Yeah, we should always understand the nature of war doesn't change. It's the character of war that is changing, and in many ways, it's the characteristics that we need to emphasize in relation to Ukraine. Ukraine is its own context, and we need to be very careful about the way we draw general principles from a specific context. What I see in Ukraine is essentially a 20th century war. It's got some modern features, but essentially what we're seeing on the ground is a war that would have been fought possibly in the 80s and 90s if the Cold War had gone hot. But we're moving beyond that now. You've mentioned already drones. Drones have been in operation since 1982 when the Israelis used them in the Bekaa Valley. It's microprocessing, it's all sorts of imaging and technologies that have made them more viable now. What we've seen is the use of so-called suicide drones. They were used in Nagorno-Karabakh 4 years before the current war started. So that's not new. And drones really have been coming forward, I think, for about 15 years now in all environments. So this is really a major test bed for things that were already in operation. What I think is different in the war in Ukraine is the way in which if you are at war and it involves your own country, we're back to the days where the whole of society, every single aspect of human life within a country is involved in combating the threat. We've seen a lot of commercial applications. So we've had Elon Musk providing satellite terminals, 5,000 of them, to the Ukrainian forces, so they don't have to rely on other commercial networks. We've seen a steady supply of what I call anti-armor weapons. And I think another key issue is the old myth that it took a tank to kill a tank is no longer viable. You've got all sorts of handheld mini systems that can take out armor. We've seen other systems that can take out aircraft and helicopters. And so the whole battlefield now is being affected by the microprocessing revolution, such that you can get weapons in the hands of, say, ordinary infantrymen and single people who can actually take out major systems. Now, that has implications, of course, not just for people who are fighting on behalf of states, but also what we call sub-state players, terrorists, criminals, all these other people around the world. So what I'm seeing across the whole of the Ukraine war is the democratization of violence, both within society and across society. And this is something we're going to have to cope with in future.
And if we could just go back to where we started, what do you think is the best hope for bringing the current crisis over grain exports to an end?
Well, right now, I think we've got to see how the various threats of violence in the face of trying to export grain and other commodities from Ukraine play out. Whether the Russians are bluffing, whether the Ukrainians are obviously able to deter the Russians from doing that by countervailing violence on their own. I think the best option for doing that, as I hinted at the start, is we actually establish a humanitarian corridor on the western side of the Black Sea and say, look, there are populations in the world that will be starving if these commodities don't get out. And I've always thought that the best way of dealing with this sort of thing is to challenge the Russians to actually attack a humanitarian corridor or humanitarian supplies going out of Ukraine. So I think my own view is that that should be tested to see whether the Russians are prepared to actually go across that line and breach a humanitarian corridor.
Rear Admiral Dr Chris Parry, thank you very much for your time. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.